Sweden, the mid-1600s. A simple argument between two children sparks a horrific series of witch trials known as the Great Noise.
It was a girl, Gertrude, who was 11 years old, and a boy, Mats.
They're both goat herds. It's a summer's day and some goats have got loose, and in that ingenious way goats have of making trouble, have managed to put themselves on a small island in a river so they're hard to get.
They get into an argument and Gertrude goes to this little island and she gets them back. Mats gets embarrassed because she is the one that fetches the goats.
It's a childish dispute, of which there were probably hundreds of thousands in Europe at the time, but it's what's made of that story that makes it much more sinister.
Having fallen out with a younger girl, he's bent on revenge by spreading smear stories. And when they go back home, Matt Nilsson tells his family that Gertrude walked on water to the islet to get the goats.
He also told his father that she could walk on water because she had asked for help from the devil.
This would have meant nothing if the village hadn't happened to have an inquisitive religious minister who is obsessed by Satan.
This argument about herding goats causes the greatest witch panic in Northern Europe.
The Great Noise is the name of a major series of witch trials in Sweden during the years from 1668 to 1676.
Up until 1668, Sweden had very few witch trials, and then this exploded. And within these 7-8 years, 300 people were executed.
It's a very kind of unusual, anomalous period of time in relation to the general history of witch trials in Sweden. This is a Lutheran context, so we're in a Protestant Lutheran context. People will always have believed in magic. They'll always have believed in the possibility that witches could work magic. What you see in the 17th century is more of a spread of those demonological ideas about witchcraft as a group activity, witchcraft as a possible heresy.
Witch hunting was dying out in its traditional heartlands like Germany and England, and the northern periphery of Sweden was where it broke out after the big witch hunts were over in Central Europe.
The children, Gertrude and Mats, lived in a village called Åsen that was part of the parish Älvängen in Dalarna. It was a small village. I suppose everyone knew each other very well. When this story got known in the village and the vicar heard of it, he wanted to interrogate Gertrude and ask what she had to do with the devil.
Some of these local ministers are particularly zealous moralists, and they're looking for sin and looking for the works of the devil in what might, first of all, be fairly innocent stories and arguments.
Normally, a pastor would call in the suspected parishioner, and he would probably start by questioning her and also admonishing her that she should tell the truth for the sake of her own salvation.
We don't know about what happened, but we can be sure that he was harsh and he used cruel methods to frighten Gertrude, who was 11 years old.
He spends an entire winter on and off trying to get Gertrude to confess to being a witch. And she might have escaped if another boy, this time a 15-year-old, hadn't told the minister that he had had a vision in the woods in which he had seen Gertrude being transported off to join the witches' sabbat at Blåkulla.
Blåkulla is a mythological place where the witches met with the devil, and the place where the witches took children. The witches and the abducted children flew to Blåkulla on animals, sometimes upside down, cows, but also on broomsticks or other things.
The idea of Blåkulla, which means Blue Mountain, is centuries old by the 1660s. The first evidence for it consists of wall paintings in late medieval Scandinavian churches, and they very clearly show witches, some on very early broomsticks, flying off to Blåkulla.
The idea really is that witches have a regular meeting place, and this is common to a number of different cultures of witchcraft. But in this case, it's a particular mountain top called the Blåkulla, and it's assumed that witches from all over Sweden can gather on this mountain top.
The Blåkulla descriptions differ from other Sabbath stories. It's the idea that this is also a bright place.
People danced and they had a lot of food to eat. They also often got nice gifts from the devil.
Somehow it's more festive, and when the witches meet the devil, they have more fun.
So they have the positive things, but they also have the evil things.
Worshipping Satan, promising loyalty to Satan, eating, drinking, dancing back to back and doing most things in reverse, then finding that the food and drink turns to ashes or leaves you hungry and thirstier than before.
There were also orgies of some kinds where the witches got laid by the devil.
The witches' Sabbath is a sexually charged place, and the entire relationship is always defined by somewhat the witch showing her allegiance to the devil. And then you have that idea of when witches defy the devil, and he would comb off their skin and he would put it on spikes and he would torment them forever.
It's a folkloric idea that children might be abducted to the witches' Sabbath, but the authorities seem to be willing to go with it. Somehow it makes the transition from crazy folktale to, oh, wait a minute, this is real, this is actually happening.
Over many months, the priest interrogates Gertrude, desperate to force a confession from the innocent girl.
The minister thinks he's got a critical mass of evidence against Gertrude, and Gertrude breaks and begins to confess.
When Gertrude finally confessed, she actually confessed that she had walked on water. Her feet had been rubbed with oil, and that was what made her able to walk on water. What happened to her was what happened in a lot of witch trials. They were broken down, but they were also maybe starting to believe things. She would have heard the same questions over and over again. And a parish priest would appeal to her conscience, telling her that it would be for the sake of her own salvation if she would only make a full confession. So she would probably have thought at some point that this would be of her own good to confess, or maybe she would even have started to believe it.
She gives us her reason for confessing after denying everything all winter, that an angel has appeared to her at Blåkulla and told her if she doesn't fess up, then a famine's going to hit Sweden and loads of people are going to starve to death. And that way Gertrude reveals herself as a kind of patriotic heroine, and so worthy of sympathy and reprieve.
What interrogators in witchcraft trials always wanted to do was to map the group of people that were involved in this, because the interrogators want to have confirmation that this is not just a one-time event. This is something that happens regularly.
Every time you got a witch, the court wanted to know which other witches she knew of in this area.
She corroborates all the details of the revels there and of worshipping Satan, and of there being lots of other witches present.
They wouldn't just say, I've been taken to a Sabbath. They would say, I have been taken by a very specific individual.
She also provides a backstory, which is how years before, the person who took her to Blåkulla, and therefore is really the most to blame for everything, is a former maidservant in her father's household called Morit Jonsdotter. And this is where the match is applied to the feuds of the Swedish witch hunt.
As the interrogations continue, Gertrude gives more terrifying details of the witch's Sabbath she attended with her family's former maidservant, Morit.
What Gertrude is telling during her interrogations is confirming their worst fears. Somebody were taking the children to the cult of the devil. This could not be more horrible to the early modern dwellers.
There's some family business involved here because it turns out that her father had tried to marry Morit and that another suitor of the maid had beaten the father up and humiliated him.
The plans for a marriage was postponed. I think Gertrude accusing Morit has something to do with this old conflict.
This is now an accusation against an adult because the maidservant concerned is in her late 30s and so a prime target for a proper accusation.
When the people in Morit's village heard of these accusations, they immediately arranged a court session in Lillhärad in this village where Morit lived.
The father of Gertrude, presumably both with a grudge against his ex-employee, Morit, and also a desire to try and save his daughter, actually testifies his own belief that Morit was a witch.
He claims that she has made him sick, that she rode him across the sky to Blåkulla. It's no coincidence that we have these accusations from men towards women where men have lost face. We very much have to interpret witchcraft accusations within the gender hierarchy. I don't think there can be any doubt that he did this out of vengeance.
All three of Morit's siblings, who are much younger than she is, accuse her of doing everything that Gertrude said she'd done. So these youngsters have clearly taken against their elder sister and are out to get her as well. So all this piles up a formidable convergence of evidence against poor Morit from both Gertrude's family and her own family.
We don't know if they were forced to do so or if they got manipulated in some way that made them perhaps also believe that this was true.
It's quite common for girls to get their own back in these ways. The society that produced the witch trials was viciously hierarchical, and children were completely at the beck and call of older relatives, typically. This led to a situation in which children were able to exercise a really powerful counterstrike against the older women who dominated their lives by accusing those older women of witchcraft.
There are some glorious juvenile details in the testimony of poor Morit's siblings, being made to sign their names in a special big black book containing those of people who've given their allegiance to Satan.
The most important thing in Blåkulla actually was that the devil wanted the visitors to write their name in his black book, and he used their own blood then. That meant that the visitors, the children and the witches had made a pact with the devil.
The idea grew up that on taking somebody into his service, the devil put a brand on them, a special kind of mark.
The devil's mark is something that we see in a number of trials all over Europe. It could be a mole, a birthmark. It could also simply be a small bump in the skin.
Morit actually had a scar on one of her fingers, and the court thought that that was where the devil had taken blood from her to write her name in the book.
An enormous pressure is put on Morit to confess: bullying, threats, sleep deprivation, etc. At this stage, Swedish law will not allow the execution of somebody who refuses to confess. She very bravely refuses to confess, but it doesn't actually rescue Morit.
In April 1669, Morit was sentenced guilty despite her denial.
She's in fact put back in prison, and she will be staying there for 4 more years before anything else happens to her.
The whole witch hunt centred upon Morit didn't die down because the lurid stories had spread like wildfire through the neighbouring region.
What happened in the Great Noise is that you determine that witchcraft becomes a crimen exceptum, which means it's an exceptional crime. You can set aside normal procedures. You could bend the laws, you could change the laws, because this was a super crime.
In 1672, the court decided that Morit should be executed despite not having confessed anything. The authorities realized that waiting for a confession didn't always work, and they thought that they had to do that. They couldn't keep those witches still working with the devil.
Of course, people talked. People were talking to their neighbors, they were talking when they met at markets. This was gossip. It had all of the bits and pieces that you find in present-day tabloid. The more official channels were in churches, and these pastors were clearly preoccupied with these stories, basically putting fear into people's minds.
You can actually see how the panic is slowly spreading from one parish to another in the province of Dalarna.
Hundreds of children come forward and tell the story that they have also been abducted to Blåkulla.
A complete moral panic begins, with parents tying their children down to the beds or having blessings put by the priests on the doorways, and a whole range of other remedies like that.
After the witch panic had traveled through the Älvdalen, it spread to Mora in the early 1669. A parish delegate from Mora goes to Stockholm with a list of 35 children's names. They want a commission to come to Mora to help them investigate these cases. Usually a witch trial would be handled in the local court, so when you did in fact issue an order to send out a commission, something really extraordinary was at play. In August 69, a commission of 8 priests and 8 laymen are sent to Mora to investigate the trials. They need to prove to local society that they take responsibility and they are taking the right measures in this, but at the same time, it's in their interest to calm things down. A common trial would be the person involved, his or her accuser, some witnesses, and you would have a large audience from local society. But the commissions and the way they worked, everything was enlarged.
The witch trials at Mora are the public entertainment of 2 decades. They are the best show in town. This is a thinly populated rural district. It's said quite credibly that 3,000 spectators turn up to the first sitting, but also when the people leave, they will fan out across the entire district, carrying vivid stories from the witnesses with them, and stoke suspicion further.
The accused people were in court, and the witnesses would tell their stories, and the interrogation was done by the members of the commissions. After they have made their interrogation, they voted on if they were guilty or not. And if there was a majority, they could condemn them to the death penalty.
The commission finishes its investigations within 2 weeks, and that is incredibly fast. It's not uncommon for a witchcraft trial to drag out in years. The fact that you can sentence 23 people within 2 weeks and interrogate hundreds of people is simply impressive.
With so many sons and daughters ensnared in the tales of Blåkulla and the witch's Sabbath, the court forces children to take the stand.
Yes, child witnesses are not as reliable as adult, but you can make them so by multiples. The testimony of two 14-year-olds equals that of one adult witness, so you keep on raising the number of children needed the further down you go to make up a competent witness.
There's always the possibility that children who tell these stories are labelled as ill, and there's always the possibility that they could be labelled as play acting or fraudulent.
On the other hand, children are kind of innocent and pure, and they haven't become corrupted in the way that adults might become.
What they testify about is something so mystical that only people who have been there, attended it, would know what happened. So they could tell you all the greasy stories and still be the victims.
I think the stories are a mixture of child fantasies, but also people making the interrogations as well as the children's parents. They used to arrange what they call wake houses, where all the children that was suspected to go to Blåkulla was held awake by some adults because they thought that the abduction happened when the children was asleep.
Once they're kept in groups, the risk is that they spread stories and ideas amongst themselves. If you're deprived of sleep, you're more likely to tell fantastic stories anyway and want to tell them so that you can get some rest. They are being done with this very misguided but probably genuine belief that people were trying to help the children.
Within a few weeks, they have 60 people on trial, they sentence 23 to death, and they end up putting to death 15, and that's from Mora alone.
Why people confessed is complex. There were a lot of social pressure on them. Children crying and begging them to confess.
They are promised salvation if they confess. Maybe even the suspected are interrogated so roughly so they start believing that they have done these things. The executions took place on the 24th of August 1669. 15 people were sent to the pyres, but before being sent to the pyres, they were all beheaded.
The logic at the time was it was a very tiny shred of mercy shown to the condemned by killing them quickly before their remains were burnt.
Once they are beheaded, their heads and their bodies are tied to stakes so that the observers can see them clearly, and then they're burned to ashes, hanging from the stakes in clumps like grapes.
The underlying notion is that to rid the area of witches, you have to completely destroy their bodies as well. Just killing them and depriving their body of volition would do the job.
These executions are made possible by the hundreds of child witnesses drawn into Mora's witch trials. Their testimonies secure convictions and executions, but the children have also incriminated themselves.
Some of the children were punished because they had been in Blåkulla. They could be flogged or they could be shamed in the church.
Or it can be made into a running of the gauntlet, whereby a posse of adults line up and the child is made to run between them and is thrashed heavily or lightly according to the personality of the adult concerned. It's possible they're also regarded with a certain amount of esteem in their communities for having brought really evil adults to their deaths.
Because there had been very few executions for witchcraft before this time in Sweden, the impact of the public executions would have been immense.
Observers, especially in Stockholm and the royal court, are beginning to ask hard questions about the speed with which the trials were conducted and the carelessness with which evidence was evaluated.
One of the members of the council is reported to have said that the more you touch this, the worse it will get. That if you acted drastically in this kind of crisis, it could only get worse.
At the same time, we have these demands from the parishes to send out new commissions, so even though the government find them ineffective, they are still under pressure from local societies.
The Mora trials are a centrifuge, with thousands of people having watched them. These people then go home and spread all the stories they've heard there. Once the children start to dish up the stories, the spreading waves of accusation become hard to stop. The spotlight shifts to a hitherto totally obscure parish in rural north-central Sweden called Tors&aring, and that's going to become the quintessence of horror in Swedish witch trials.
Tors&aring is a small society in Norrland in the province of Ångermanland, close to the coastline in the northern of Sweden. They were farmers and they had crop failures this year and the year before also. It was difficult times for them.
We now bring a really interesting character onto the stage. He is a proper villain of the piece. His name is Laurentius Horneus, and he is a young, ambitious Lutheran minister. Unfortunately, everything, it seems, that we know about his career as a witch hunter comes from 2 generations later, from his grandson working on some local records and also on stories told to him when he was a child by his grandmother. So the evidence in this case is a little bit dodgy, but it is the most spectacular single witch hunt in Sweden.
2 years after being installed as a pastor, he receives a letter from the central government that he should investigate and start trials against potential witches.
And if they could also get these suspected witches to confess, that would be the best.
Compared to his colleagues, he was taking this order very, very seriously.
This clergyman was so committed to the idea that there were witches that he was willing to do almost anything to ensure that the case could be properly prosecuted and the accused convicted. Witch trial is, among other things, an opportunity for fame and fortune. If you are a fairly ordinary justice of the peace or clergyman and you successfully prosecute lots of people for witchcraft, you get your name in the papers. You stop being Joe Ordinary and become somebody who's rid the world of a major menace.
Horneus, he was the one responsible for the children witnesses. He used what is called visgossar, wise boys. There were a couple of boys in this area that said that they had capability to see who were the real witches.
And they can do so simply by looking at them and seeing signs on the forehead that mark somebody as a witch. They are generally very poor, they're early teenage.
They were traveling around in this area, offering parishes and priests that they could point out the witches if they only got paid.
They are believed because they're supposed to be the kind of people who go to the witches' Sabbath, taken on and groomed by adult witches.
When people came out of service, they would stand and they would point to the people that they would believe were witches. Everybody would fear meeting these boys.
Could be enemies of their families, people they've fallen out with, or it could be the people that the minister has primed them to identify.
One of them actually accuses Horneus' own wife, and she has the presence of mind to slap the adolescent across the face. And realizing people are turning on him, he then claims he was blinded by the sun and made a mistake and backpedals very fast.
The torture methods applied by Laurentius are gruesome. He would be what we would call a true sadist, I think. He would dunk children and people into ice water, and he would shovel the children into ovens. If you had seen the images of hell in churches, just imagine how frightening it must have been to be put into an oven.
It's almost behaving like the Wicked Witch in the Hansel and Gretel tale. To catch a witch, you have to be a witch, it seems.
Laurentius does not limit himself to torturing children and suspected witches. He also tortures regular witnesses, so he is really zealous in his efforts of extracting what he believes is the truth.
The very fact that you've pinned your hopes on the idea that children will be able to tell you about being kidnapped by witches means that you want the next child that you speak to confirm that version of the story and make your case for you. You tend to sort of sink all your intellectual and legal capital in a particular version of events.
He would often construct testimony by taking really rather fragmented, inadequate testimony from a number of different witnesses and fusing it together to make one polished and apparently convincing single testimony.
Now Horneus has completed his vicious investigations. The trial in Tors&aring can begin. Overseen by the local authorities, it will become one of the bloodiest witch trials in Sweden.
In an ordinary witchcraft trials, you would have maybe one, maybe two, maybe three suspects charged with witchcraft. Maybe you will have one execution. Laurentius Horneus had in fact 100 people charged for witchcraft at the same time. That was the largest group of people in the entire course of events.
His work is to round up the confessors, especially among the children, also to appear as a witness during the trials. He's not one of the jury, he's just a witness, but he's a very active witness.
Almost 700 people live in the area, and Horneus forces over 100 of them, mostly children, to make diabolical and devastating accusations in court.
There's the usual mixture of generic stuff like going off to Blåkulla and dancing, and there's the vivid detail like the story of milking barrels of milk from the forefinger of a member of your family, and then taking off the milk to Blåkulla to make butter for the party.
The accused were kept in prison in different houses. They didn't have to lock the doors. They stayed there voluntarily. It wasn't easy for them to run away because where should they go? But it's difficult to understand that they didn't take the chance.
It's entirely plausible that so many of the accused confess because they've been convinced that it'll simply not be viable to decimate the workforce of the community. And so to get it over with quickly and present the authorities with an absolutely impossible legal conundrum seems a very good way of short-circuiting the system.
Almost 100 suspects are put on trial. The commission finds a staggering 71 guilty of witchcraft. Despite the verdict, the convicted witches are spared from execution. For now.
1st of June, 1675. It is the beginning of the Swedish midsummer, and the whole community is at church.
They were going to church, thinking that everything was back to normal. If they were suspected of witchcraft, they would not have been let into a service. Somebody somewhere must have said to these people that you are off the hook.
And somebody who is not the minister of the community stands up and gives a hellfire sermon against witches. On a signal from him, the 71 accused people are rounded up by the rest of their community.
All of a sudden, the door is closed on them. And they're not attending a service anymore. And they're all told that they're to be executed this morning. So when the door closes in the church, it must have been an atmosphere of panic, of fear, anxiety. They're dragged out of church and they're forced to walk by their neighbors, by their families, pushing them, even though they're resisting.
The neighbors and the people in this parish guarded the way for the witches to the place of execution. They were standing in rows and in that way hindering them from any escape. It seems as if the relatives were emotionally cold in this situation and that they actually drove their relatives to their death. Some of the relatives really believed that their wife or mother actually was a witch.
They are frog march 3 miles uphill to a place which is known by various names now, of which Witch Mountain is the most often quoted. Some of them walk with dignity and speed, some bring up the rear lamenting. They are driven up the slope and see in front of them these 3 enormous bonfires, one for each parish in the region.
At the mountain, the bonfires are ready. This stage has been set for the executions. This is not a spontaneous act.
One by one, they are beheaded. They are so numerous that they have to be beheaded with the heads and the blood heading downhill so that the blood won't extinguish the fires which have now been lit. Their bodies are piled up upon the enormous pyres of brushwood and roasted to pieces.
By the end of the day, 71 people from this small area were executed. 1/5 of all the women in these towns. That is very, very hard to believe how damaging and horrible this must have been to local society.
Households would have been ruined right across the community. It's really the furthest extreme to which a local witch trial can logically go.
The president of the 4th Commission, his name was Sparre, when he learned that they did execute, he got furious. What he has told the sub-commissions was that they shouldn't do any executions without consulting him. So he wrote down to the government and got the commission dissolved.
According to the record of memory, the wise boys, the young adolescents who point out suspects coming out of church, were murdered. Their bodies, hacked to pieces, were found by the roadside soon after the incident. So there a rough kind of justice does seem to have been done.
Many of the witnesses, due to the torture that Horneus applied on them, were crippled afterwards. So they had to live in the society together with the men that crippled them.
According to his grandson, people were afraid of him, afraid of passing by his house. We know that he tried to get another parish later on, and he didn't get it. So his career didn't improve.
He seems to have done nothing else of note for the rest of his life. He just goes back to being a nobody, having apparently produced the worst judicial atrocities in the entire history of Sweden.
When we reach the summer of 1675, the news of the witch trials have been known in Stockholm for many years. This is not something that they have been confronted with, at least not the gruesome details.
Now, fresh accusations from a teenage boy will not only bring the witch trials to the capital of Stockholm itself, but also reach new levels of brutality.
The witch hunt in Stockholm itself is precipitated by a loose-lipped adolescent. He's 13 years old, he comes from the countryside outside Stockholm, and he brings in the usual claims of flying to Blåkulla, seeing other people there, and in doing so, of course, kickstarts a witch hunt.
He's called the Gävle boy because he was from Gävle, and he started pointing out women in Stockholm as people he had met in Blåkulla.
And because of the rumours of witches' sabbats and child witnesses, which have been leaking into Stockholm now for almost a decade, in one rather poor area of the city it produces a classic witch hunt.
They form a commission in Stockholm. Some of the members of this commission are skeptical to the children's witnesses.
The witch hunt in the Katarina suburb in Stockholm is a small one. There are 8 women accused, but the particularly notorious episode is that one of the women concerned, Malin Matsdotter, is not only found guilty and executed, but she's actually burned alive, which is very rare for a convicted witch.
And I think it was because they thought that she was so eager not to confess and to protest about the trials.
There's a big difference between seeing a corpse burning and seeing a human person being burned to death. We cannot underestimate the impression this must have left on people to seeing a person being burned to death.
The decisive turning point in the Swedish witch trials is when the child witnesses begin to confess themselves to having made up their stories. Sensing that the tide of opinion is turning against them, others of the child witnesses in the Katarina trials confess to having given false witness. And the end product of this, the very last victim of the Katarina trials, is that the witness who kicked them off in the first place, the Gavle boy, is himself tried and sentenced to death for perjury, and he is hanged.
After the boy is sentenced to execution for perjury, the government decides to put a lid on this, to put an end to the witch trials.
There are no more commissions. There's no more tacit encouragement from the centre for clergy to go around urging on accusations.
They simply state that there are no more witches in Sweden. And this is basically as interesting and as odd as the start of all this panic, that you can simply just state that, well, end of it. This is not just something that you can decide from the government, because the devil is still out there. This doesn't make sense that you can simply decide there are no more witches.
This is a small country with a low population. The victims are generally in thinly populated rural districts, and so the impact on the communities concerned is devastating in a way that bigger witch hunts are not.
And then you have thousands of children that appeared as accuser and were engaged in getting people convicted and killed. Considering that we don't have such big witch hunts in Sweden before or since the Great Noise, it's an exceptional event.
These brutal Swedish witch hunts have come to an end. Over 9 years, around 200 people have been slaughtered for the impossible crime of witchcraft. By the last decades of the 17th century, people throughout Europe begin to question whether witches truly exist. The age of the great European witch hunt is drawing to a close, but it isn't over yet.